Well, I've done it again. I've spent hours and hours diving into the history books researching a garment instead of just sewing the damn thing. Hello friends, and welcome back to my channel. Let's just jump right into the topic for today's video, the Edwardian jumper dress. This is my latest obsession, and today, since I still don't have a sewing space, I'll be scratching the historical costuming itch by taking a close look at this outfit and trying to identify what exactly was a jumper dress, when were they in fashion, why were they so popular, and how did the style change over time. This might not be a comprehensive or completely infallible presentation. I'm not a trained historian, and this garment falls outside of my normal wheelhouse of study by about a decade, but it should be interesting, well-informed, and hopefully entertaining. This does mean, though, that I'll have to condense several weeks of reading into a 20 or so minute spiel, and inevitably there will be details or examples that get left out. So if you would like to look through all of the articles and examples I found while researching the topic, the whole list of links, all of which are available online for free, will be available in my Ko-fi for monthly supporters at all levels. So first things first, I think we should start out with a general description of the garment in question so that we're all on the same page, and then we can begin tracing its origins back down the fashion timeline. While certain elements will change with the times, generally speaking, a jumper dress was a relatively looser fitting garment with large neck and armholes that meant that the dress could be pulled on over the head, skipping the tedium of closing a zillion hooks and eyes. They were either sleeveless or with short sleeves, as they were meant to be worn with a separate blouse underneath. And this is probably a good time to mention that this blouse is very often called a gimp, and that's G-U-I-M-P-E, and it usually featured a high neck, long sleeves, and a fancy yoke that was usually quite visible under the larger neckline of the jumper. Lastly, the jumper was almost always cinched at the waist with a belt or girdle. The specific term used varies across the years, but its presence is ubiquitous. Now that we have a general idea of what I mean when I say jumper dress, let's try to see where it originated. Not necessarily an easy task, since the terminology changes every season and across different publications, but I think I've figured it out. So while the term jumper is mainly used from 1907 through the first half of 1909, we can trace both its origins and evolution far beyond this small window of time. Earlier garments might not necessarily be called jumpers, but they clearly share many of the same traits and were almost definitely the predecessors of the jumper dress. Likewise, even after the term jumper falls out of fashion, we can clearly see its evolution into other garments that are virtually identical, just slightly modified to evolve with the ever-changing fashion trends. As the trend falls out of fashion, so too does the vocabulary used to describe it. So the first use of the word jumper I was able to find was in early 1906, and it was in the children's garment section, where it was described as a genuine novelty, as well as a garment to be slipped over the head, having no means of closing, and worn over a simple gimp. Does this sound familiar? That could have been the end of it, except that I found several other articles from slightly later in the same year that clearly implied that the jumper dress had been around and fairly popular in prior years, so I looked back even further. I thought I had lost the trail for a while, but it turns out that I just needed to change my keywords, because in 1905, suspender waists were all the rage. Or at least that's what one article called them. No one seemed to actually agree on what these garments should be called, as indicated by the vast variety of terms I found used to describe them. But the design was virtually the same. 2 strips of fabric or ribbon that passed over the shoulders and was finished with a belt. This article from 1905 describes a children's garment, but in a shape that we see echoed in adult garments, namely a simple skirt with suspenders of the same fabric that were broader at the shoulder, narrower at the waist, joined by a horizontal band to keep the straps from slipping off the shoulders, and decorated with an embroidered design. These same elements will be retained, but highly embellished as the trend reaches the adult audience. And in fact, a later article flat out states that the trend originated with these children's garments, saying that in reality, the children's dresses were the first to exhibit this now accepted and generally preferred fashion. While the overall design of these suspender girdles was rather similar, the details varied widely. According to one article, the bretelles are of all conceivable shapes and sizes. They cross in the back and in the front, they meet above the shoulder blades in cape or sailor collar effect, they overhang the sleeves in points and squares, and they are wide or narrow, single, double, or triple according to fancy. They show embroidery wrought directly upon the material, or they are inserted with motifs of lace wreathed in French knots or eyelet holes. It's also interesting to note that at this point, the blouses being worn under these suspenders generally featured sleeves that were very large and poofy. This article shows the reader over several pages how to make their own suspender gown, including details of how to make the girdle, how to cover cord for piping, and where to use it in the design. It recommends fabric types and interlining options for various styles and effects, and includes details on things like how to work and retain the sharp corners of the revers. It's too lengthy and detailed to go into here, but it's an absolutely fascinating article, and I've made sure to highlight it among all the other resources I used for this video. While earlier suspenders seemed to be fairly simple in construction, that design would quickly morphed into more and more elaborate shapes, with the bretelles getting bigger, using up more fabric, and covering more of the torso than previous models. Slowly, the suspenders started to look less like an accessory and more like a garment in and of themselves. So, keeping that trend in mind, let's skip ahead to the spring of 1907, where we really start to see the term jumper come into use to describe a garment intended for adults. And a great example of the current state of this fashion can be seen in number 1971, a lady's jumper or overblouse, tucked or box-pleated on the shoulders and slipped over the head. This jumper has all the main elements of what I'm considering a jumper dress. It's got the large neckline, it's slipped on over the head, it features a large armscye with short sleeves, which contrast against the long sleeves of the gimp underneath, and the waistline is drawn in by a belt. It's also got another element that we see a lot in these jumpers, which is the fancy trim along the open edges of the neck and sleeves, which is potentially echoed at the hemline of the skirt as well, although we'll never know for sure since in this example it's not shown. The article then lists some useful construction details for the intrepid sewist who might want to recreate such a garment, such as the fact that the jumper should be joined at the shoulder seams and then the tucks made, so that the same tucks carry across from the front of the bodice to the back. These tucks allow for a nice fullness at the waist, which the article describes as giving a becoming roundness to the figure. By this time, the classic pigeon breast is being softened and streamlined, the S-bend silhouette is on its way out, eventually to be replaced with the resurgence of the empire or high-waisted silhouette. So, for the moment, the jumper keeps some of the fullness around the waist, but not so much that it puffs out and sags below the waistline. This fullness is managed, at least in this example, by the use of shearing in the back and a set of strings at the side seams that are tied in the front. The neckline is large enough that the jumper needs no closures, and the sleeves are simple cap sleeves that are left open from the armhole to the lower edge of the sleeves to reveal the sleeves of the underblouse. The woman on the far left of the original image is also wearing a jumper, this one being a good representation of another design that eventually will get called a skeleton jumper. This style, also called a skeleton waist, is much less documented, at least in the sources I could find, but it does come up now and again, and its main characteristic is that, as the name implies, it's just the bare bones or skeleton of a normal jumper, often made up of several vertical bands of fabric joined by much narrower horizontal strips either of the main fabric or a trimming fabric or ribbon. There's more coverage here than the earlier suspender frocks, but in many more separate pieces than the normal jumper waist. The article describes that the bands should be made out of the same material as the skirt it's meant to be worn with, or at least a material that harmonizes with it, and that they should be reinforced with a thin interlining of muslin to give them some body and stiffness. These jumpers could be made from the offcuts of the rest of the costume, thus giving variety at a comparatively little outlay. Recycling fabric scraps and saving money? It's no wonder I was drawn to this style. In fact, article after article across the entire time period that I looked at praised the jumper for its incredible practicality. It was simple and cheap to make, could brighten a dull gown or rejuvenate an old one, and diversified one's wardrobe without much financial investment. One article stated that they were the solution to appearing well-dressed on a small income, while another called the jumper a suitable alternative to what the author dubbed their heretofore one resource, the shirtwaist and separate skirt. Does anyone else feel personally called out by this author from 120 years ago? So it seems that the jumper dress was the ultimate accessory, able to be styled up or dressed down to fit a number of circumstances, although that same article then goes on to explain that there are in fact two distinct classes of jumper, one that would be suitable for casual day wear, worn with two-piece street suits and shirtwaists, in which case the jumper must match the skirt, ideally both in fabric type and in color, but at least in color. The other class of jumper would be the fancy one, worn with silk or wool skirts for semi-formal evening occasions such as dinner, concerts, or the theater. In this case, however, the jumper is allowed to have a distinct contrast in both color and material from the dress it was worn with, leading me to wonder if maybe there weren't several jumpers that could in fact fill both roles. Besides being economical in that it required little fabric and often could be made from scraps and remnants, other articles highlighted how the use of jumpers allowed the wearer a way to recycle and repurpose shirtwaists, where the top portion was still pretty and in good condition, but maybe the sleeves were out of date or the underarms were worn out. These portions could be cut off and removed, and the good portion kept and mounted onto a chemisette, much like these seen here. This fantastic article from early 1908 gives us not only directions on how to modify an old waist into a newer, more fashionable jumper waist, but it also indirectly gives us insight into the trendy silhouettes and lines of the time. In the old version, the shoulders are short, the sleeves simply huge and in an old-fashioned form, and no doubt the material is worn under the arms. So we can infer the favored silhouette from previous years emphasized slim shoulders, wide sleeves, and a square neckline. It also blouses too much at the belt, again referring to the pouting pigeon breast silhouette that is starting to slowly fall out of fashion. In order to bring this costume up to style, the article instructs the wearer to cut the arm size out, starting 2 to 4 inches at the bottom of the sleeve and tapering to nearly nothing at the shoulders, being sure to remove all of the worn or stained underarm portions. The worn sleeves are to be removed and presumably shortened and reattached, judging by the images, but it's not fully clear. The neck edge can be finished with a fold of velvet or silk, the same thing for the newer, larger armhole, and a matching belt is to be made up as well. The extra fabric at the front can be trimmed down by up to 1.5 inches, and the square neckline is cut round. And voila! Your decidedly old-fashioned waist is now turned into a smart-looking jumper waist in keeping with the latest trends. So as we head further into 1908, we see even more slashing of the fabric, often along the shoulders or the waistline, which, by the way, continues to be girdled with a belt, although it is slowly rising slightly past the natural waistline. Oftentimes, entire sleeves are joined to the bodice only by thin strips of ribbon or trim. Where in 1907, I'd say the popular necklines were predominantly circular, in 1908 we start to see increasingly more and more geometric necklines being favored, oftentimes V-necked, including large dipping V's in the front and the back, but also other geometric variations, although rarely are they just square. The round neckline is still there, it hasn't fallen out of fashion, it's just that other variations are gaining in popularity. This article that I came across might in fact help explain why the angular lines became more prominent. It describes in some detail the increasing popularity and availability of what the article calls bordered goods, meaning lengths of fabric that have geometric designs along the borders, making them easily incorporated as trimming elements in garments. While this is not a new concept by any means, this article describes how that year's designs are created in a new process, not by weaving the patterns into the fabric, but by stamping them on top, a process which is simpler, quicker, and presumably less labor-intensive. The article also attributes the rising popularity of these prints to the fact that this season, these motifs are available in much more affordable fabrics than the previous season, where they had been limited to hand-painted nets and chiffons. Thus, we see many outfits including these bordered fabrics in their design, and the jumper outfit is no exception, with many jumpers using the geometric designs as the classic trimming for the armholes, necklines, and as accents on the skirt. Since these designs are printed along the selvage of the fabric, in order to use them, the jumper must necessarily adapt its style to have straight lines in place of curves. Another article noting the popularity of the bordered fabrics in this season's jumpers mentions that skirts of this material require a pleated skirt with a straight lower edge, which makes sense since cutting the hem on a curve would ruin the bordered design, and so the only alternative is to keep the fabric straight and pleat it into the waistline. Then, right around the middle of 1908, we see the term jumper dress, also often called a semi-princess dress, start to come into popularity, which coincides nicely with roughly the same time that skirts and bodices in general start to be joined. Prior to this point, outfits that looked to us like one-piece dresses were almost always two separate garments, with the join between them covered by a belt. But then the long, unbroken vertical lines of the princess style came into fashion, and in the jumper we start to see this applied by cutting the front gore of the skirt and the front of the blouse in one continuous panel, while the sides and the back often still remained separate and, again, joined at the waistline with a belt or girdle. Multiple garments across different publications describe this phenomenon, sometimes calling it a semi-princess dress, other times describing a jumper waist joined to a skirt, but all of them emphasizing how the princess style is carried out. When the jumper takes this style, the belt is sometimes foregone in order to preserve those vertical lines, or as in this interesting example, the belt actually passes under the pleats, allowing for the waist to be cinched in as desired, but without visually breaking up the vertical lines. With the loss of the belt, however, the jumper dress must naturally be more closely fitted to the body for the correct silhouette, and we start to see those garments include closures rather than being loose enough to be pulled on over the head. A few listings from this time seem to emphasize how the sleeves and armhole bands increased the visual breadth of the shoulders, clearly implying that it was a desirable look, but I didn't find enough evidence of this to consider it necessarily an overarching trend, although it was right about here, mid-1908 or so, that I noticed the sleeves of the underblouse starting to lose some of their volume and poof. If you are more familiar with this time period and would like to weigh in here, please leave a comment below and we can all learn something together. Regardless, arm and neck holes both continue to be large and were often described with various terms such as Japanese style, kimono style, or Ottoman armholes, clearly showing the provenance of the inspiration for such styles. There is some mention of using the fitted body lining of the jumper as a gimp, suggesting the joining of the jumper and the underwaist into one garment, but it's not yet a common trend. The majority of garment descriptions still list the overblouse and jumper as having a separate underblouse or gimp, and indeed that's a large part of the appeal of the concept, because multiple articles describe how the nature of the jumper outfit can be changed solely by the selection of which gimp one wears underneath. This article from October of 1908 discusses packing light for a weekend visit and suggests that you can bring one jumper with 3 gimps and be covered for several kinds of occasion and be well dressed for each. Another from January of the following year describes how the jumper is an important part of every woman's wardrobe and that the character of the dress is determined in large extent by the gimp that one wears. In a period where it was still common practice, at least among certain classes, to change outfits multiple times a day and to have different ensembles for different occasions, the jumper seems to have a unique role in that it can, to some extent, cross over and serve as appropriate for many different situations, simply by changing the blouse that was worn beneath it. Moving into 1909, we really see the general silhouette changing, preferring one that's taller, slimmer, and generally just elongated, with an increasingly high waistline, and the jumper dress is no exception, although the name jumper seems to have fallen out of fashion. It's almost never used, with magazines preferring the term bretelle skirt or semi-princess dress. The bretelle skirt is visually similar to the suspender gowns of 1905, but where the earlier styles were attached either to the belt or to the bodice, now they're often joined to the skirt and sometimes are even cut as one piece of fabric to maintain those fashionably long lines. Apparently, not everyone was so keen on the concept of the joined skirt and bodice, though. As this article points out, the whole costume effect appeals to most women, even though they may not want a whole dress with the skirt and waist attached. The look was nice, but the practicality of the outfit suffered, proving that the struggle of fashion versus function is timeless. Here comes the bretelle skirt to the rescue, however, proving yet again the practicality and multifunctionality of the garment as it served to visually unite the bottom and top halves of the outfit together without requiring that the bodice or waist was sewn in. Gored skirts with pleated panels were all the rage, and you've got bretelle skirts with 4 gores, 6 gores, 8 gores, you name it, often with some of them having additional pleating. We also see lots of garments like these, which are still called semi-princess dresses, but which clearly share many of the same traits of the jumper dress, just tweaked a little to satisfy the evolving styles. We still got separate panels of fabric joined by small strips of trimming, wide necklines, and short sleeves of the same fabric as the rest of the jumper, which allow for a nice view of the shirtwaist worn underneath. Shoulder seams appear to have returned to the natural shoulder point rather than being exaggeratedly broad, and the armscye, even on the bretelle skirts, is no longer large and open, but is shrinking back to a more moderate size. The sleeves of the blouse worn underneath are also noticeably slimmer, with nearly no extra volume in the arms. The front panel of the jumper is now almost always one piece, continued from the skirt into the bodice section, but we still usually see a strip of fabric acting as a belt on the sides and back of the garment to visually break up the dress and probably also to cinch in the waistline, which is quite high at this point with the revival of the empire silhouette. Additionally, we can see that buttons are really coming into vogue as a decorative item. Beyond this point, the jumper dress, as I'm interested in it, falls almost completely out of style. The overblouse tends to be more consistently joined with the underblouse, as we can see here in this article from 1910. Sometimes the oversleeves are omitted completely as the whole outfit becomes unified into fewer and fewer pieces. This reduction of individual elements within one ensemble, while practical, also eliminates what for me is one of the more appealing functions of the jumper dress, which is its ability to be mixed and matched with a variety of gimps and potentially skirts to form a sort of capsule wardrobe. We're still pre-World War I, and a woman of good taste was still expected to change outfits based on the time of day and the activity that they were partaking in. I mean, this same article describes what changes need to be made to a waist pattern in order to make it suitable for evening wear versus afternoon wear, and that includes changing the cut of the neck, the length of the sleeves, and the color and type of fabric it's made from. The jumper dress will continue through 1915 or so and have a brief resurgence from 1922 to 27 before disappearing altogether until the pinafore dresses of the 1940s pick it back up. And if you want to see what that style looks like, I actually made one last Christmas and I'll link that video in the upper corner. It's super interesting to see where exactly this style ended up. But if we take it back to the beginning and look at the jumper dress from roughly 1905 to 1909, we can get a sense of its evolution and the changing silhouette. It starts off as mirror suspenders attached to a belt, heavily decorated, but rarely more than just rectangles of fabric. Those suspenders get fancier and larger until around 1907 it becomes a looser, almost baggy garment that's cinched in at the waist and often features cap sleeves. Then the skeleton jumper appears, being more than just suspenders, but with less coverage than the full jumper. Necklines and arm size are large, and the jumper is used to visually broaden the shoulders. Slowly, the pigeon breast disappears altogether as the waistline moves up and the arm size shrink, with an emphasis on vertical lines and princess-style fronts. Jumper skirts serve either to create the illusion of a united garment for those who wish to keep their skirts and blouses separate, or the same visual elements are morphed into the semi-princess dress for those who prefer a singular garment. Yet, throughout all of these changes, we can see some elements that persevere, such as the wide necks and short sleeves that show off the blouse that peeks through underneath, and the decorating of the neckline and sleeves with a trim that matches or complements the main fabric of the jumper. Waistlines, regardless of where they sit in comparison to the actual waist, are cinched in with a belt, and that belt usually coordinates in color with the fabric of the jumper. So now the only question remaining is, given unlimited time, skills, and resources, what would your ideal jumper look like? Do you like the suspenders on a belt look, or the fuller, more dress-like style of a jumper like this? I found so many interesting styles that I want to make all of them, and I'm definitely experiencing a bit of decision paralysis at the moment, so I don't know which version I'll be going with. I've got 4 yards of dusty rose linen and over 15 yards of matching trim, so I'm certainly looking forward to seeing what I make, and if you are too, consider subscribing. If you want a closer look at all of these articles, the link to my Ko-fi is in the description, and if you'd like to see the 1940s take on the jumper dress, you can click here. Thanks for joining me through this meandering examination of the Edwardian jumper dress, and I'll catch you in my next video. Bye! Oh, I'm melting! Ooh, just mop me up in a puddle.